The gym went quiet enough to catch the sound of someone swallowing, and it happened because of two words: hit me. They weren't thrown as a joke, but as a challenge that should never exist in a room full of witnesses. In the space of a few seconds, one controlled movement could either fracture the reputations of two powerful men or turn the night into a story no one would admit to seeing. But the real danger didn't start there. It began earlier, in measured glances, unfinished sentences, and the way Bruce Lee walked into the room as if he already knew exactly where control would be tested. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. He took that step as if the floor had already agreed to him. A narrow lane opened between shoulders and elbows, and the rope along the ring sighed under a stranger's weight. The man who had arrived loud stood quiet now, massive, steady, carrying the confidence of someone who has never been hurried by a room. He watched a quick demonstration finish, not impressed by power but curious about control, the way wrists stopped exactly where they were meant to stop. A few people murmured Bruce Lee's name without ceremony, not as a star, but as a presence that gathered a room and straightened spines. Someone smiled as if it were a joke. Someone else tilted a head as if measuring. The air smelled of sweat and liniment, with a faint metallic bite from old iron. Short questions drifted, half jokes, half probes, about distance, about speed, about what was real. They were small words, but they were arranged to test. Bruce did not answer them directly. He watched hands, how shoulders floated or locked, how weight settled into heels. He exhaled through his nose, loosened his fingers, and kept his eyes on the center of a chest instead of a face. A couple of men stepped back without meaning to, making a corridor that felt too deliberate to be chance. Then the tone shifted. It wasn't a dare yet, but it leaned that way. Someone nudged the heavyweight with a grin, meant to look friendly. The big man didn't look for trouble. He looked for edges, for where a rule might bend. That made him harder to read than someone who wanted a fight. Bruce understood the shape of the trap. Refuse, and the story would say he was theater. Accept, and he would risk bone and principle in a room that wanted a headline more than a handshake. The witnesses mattered, people whose retelling would become the truth by morning even if the details thinned out. A jump rope slapped the floor once. Gloves brushed leather with a dry click. The ring ropes creaked as someone leaned in. From the back, a single clap sounded. Not applause, more like a starter's pistol without the echo. The big man's mouth curved into something like a joke that didn't reach his eyes. Bruce didn't answer with words. He moved. Just a step, just enough to place himself where stories begin. Hit me. It landed in the quiet, like a weight dropped on wood. Plain, almost casual, and somehow heavier than a threat. A man near the ring laughed too loudly, then stopped when no one joined him. You could hear a mouthguard click between someone's teeth, an anxious habit in a moment that wasn't even official. The ropes trembled under resting forearms. The heavyweight stood with his center low and patient, hands high, as if he was inviting proof, not conversation. Bruce did not rush forward. He didn't smile back either. He lifted his eyes, then lowered them, not to the man's face, but to the line of the shoulders and the small motions that leaked intention. His foot set down so softly it sounded like he was testing thin ice. When he spoke, it was not a declaration, but a boundary. "What do you mean?" he asked, calm enough to irritate the people who wanted sparks. "A real punch? Or a controlled test?" A few voices tried to answer for the room. One, near the bags, muttered, "Don't." Another, closer to the ring, said, "Let him." The words split the air into two camps, those hungry for a story, and those suddenly aware of what a heavyweight's mistake could do. Someone shifted aside. Someone else leaned in, closing the space again. Bruce's fingers tightened for a heartbeat, and released. An impulse caught and put away. The big man repeated it, and this time the sentence sounded less like a challenge and more like an order directed at everyone present. "Watch how arguments end." He lifted his shoulders slightly. Cloth whispered against skin. His breathing was slow and deep, like an engine idling. No panic, no haste, only readiness. Bruce raised a hand, not to perform, but to request room. "Back," he said, as if he were asking people to step away from a ledge. They moved, but not far. They wanted to see every inch, every blink. He kept his posture loose, his jaw unclenched, and his gaze steady where it mattered. He did not agree to a strike to the head. He did not accept full force. He offered something smaller in words and stricter in meaning: precision. That refusal, quiet, reasonable, made the strength crowd bristle. They had come to witness dominance, and he was taking the script from their hands. The heavyweight did not soften. He held his ground and opened himself just enough, inviting an error. If Bruce misjudged and hit too hard, he would look reckless. If he held back, he would look false. For a moment, it seemed he might choose neither and simply walk away. Instead, he stayed, still, listening, until the room could feel that the next decision belonged to him, not to the noise around him. Then he lifted his eyes again, and something in the way he measured distance suggested the hit everyone imagined might not be the thing he planned to give. He closed the distance without charging it. Not straight on, but along a slanted path that kept his head off the obvious line, as if he were stepping into a draft no one else felt. He said one thing, low and even, less a warning than a concern, that nobody needed to get hurt, and that this did not have to become a brawl. The words were ordinary. The intent behind them was not. The heavyweight stayed put and seemed to offer more of himself, chest square, stance rooted. It was a display meant to force a choice. Prove something with force or look small. Bruce did neither. He altered the rhythm. A tiny step. A pause. Another tiny step. Each change asked a question of balance rather than muscle, and the big man answered without throwing a punch. His torso adjusted. His feet made a micro-correction he probably hadn't planned. Those who were close would later disagree on what happened next. Some would say there was no strike at all. Others would swear they saw a blur, a tap too fast to frame. What is certain is that it was brief and exact. No wind-up, no show. A point rather than a swing. The reaction wasn't what the room expected. The heavyweight didn't fall or shout. His face shifted for a beat, not in pain, but in surprise, as if his breathing had been interrupted mid-thought, or his weight had been nudged off its script. He blinked slower than before. One glove brushed his own body, checking sensation, checking position. The room took a second to catch up. First silence, then a scattered "oh" from different corners, unsynchronized. Someone's foot slid softly on the canvas. A switch clicked on somewhere, absurdly loud in the pause. Bruce exhaled through his nose and stepped back exactly as far as needed. No more, leaving space where the pressure had been. He didn't pursue. He didn't look to the crowd for approval. He watched the man in front of him and the people behind him, measuring whether they could accept restraint or whether they would demand escalation. That refusal to capitalize angered a few who had come for spectacle. Control can feel like an insult to appetite. The heavyweight's posture changed. The playfulness drained away, replaced by focus. He did not laugh it off. He did not retreat. In his stillness, there was a decision forming, and everyone sensed it. The ropes stopped quivering. The floor seemed to wait. Just when it looked like the moment might dissolve into something salvageable, a voice cut through with a line meant to sting pride rather than skin. The big man stepped forward, not reckless, not rushed, and the shift told the room that whatever came next would be about principle, not technique. The sound that followed wasn't laughter anymore. It was a restless scrape of voices, shoes adjusting, bodies leaning, people rehearsing the version of the story they wanted to tell later. Someone tossed out a remark about movie tricks and lightweights, not shouted, just loud enough to land. It wasn't aimed straight at Bruce, but it didn't need to be. Words like that are designed to travel sideways. The heavyweight answered without speaking. He stepped closer, and the room felt the mass before it saw the motion. His presence pressed forward, heavy and intentional, no hint of humor left. This was no longer curiosity. It was a demand to submit to his terms. Bruce didn't retreat in a straight line. He slid off to the side, changing the angle so the big man had to turn his torso to keep him centered. It was subtle, almost polite, but it forced a choice. Bruce spoke again, calm enough to sound like compromise. He suggested a short test, reaction, timing, anything but a trade of blows. It sounded reasonable. That was the trap. Chaos hates rules it didn't write. A few people tried to intervene. One voice urged them to stop. Another insisted they finish it. The crowd tightened into a half circle, too close for safety, close enough to matter. The smell of leather and rubber sharpened as bodies closed in. Somewhere, keys rattled nervously in a pocket. The heavyweight didn't nod or shake his head. He answered by setting himself differently. Feet planted, spine tall, hands adjusting with intention. Not for a joke, for a result. Bruce showed him something without touching him. A brief change of tempo, a false opening that vanished as soon as it appeared. It was enough to prove that Bruce was reading moments before they arrived. For the first time, the big man hesitated. Just a second. Just long enough for people nearby to feel it. Control had shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Then Bruce noticed the detail that changed everything. A slick patch on the canvas near one foot. A shoulder crowding too close behind the ropes. An accident waiting, even without a punch. He recalculated, eyes flicking, breath steady, choosing between backing away and holding the line. He almost guided it back toward safety. Almost. And that was when the heavyweight said one more thing, short and cutting, meant to strip away any graceful exit. If Bruce stepped back now, it wouldn't be caution they remembered. It would be surrender. Bruce stayed where he was, not defiant, resolved. And in that stillness, everyone sensed that the next move would decide whether this ended with discipline or with damage. The challenge sharpened. The heavyweight raised the stakes without raising his voice, offering a target that made the risk unmistakable. An invitation that tested nerve more than skill. It wasn't bravado now. It was pressure, the kind that asks a man to prove himself by crossing a line he can't uncross. The crowd leaned in, and the sound of it felt like a pulse behind the ears. Bruce let his eyes drift away for a heartbeat. Not avoidance, regulation. He lengthened his exhale, loosened his jaw, felt his shoulders settle downward as if weight were being placed there on purpose. When he looked back, the room sensed the change. He drew a clear boundary with plain words. There would be no wild exchange, no injury for entertainment. If anything happened, it would be controlled. Someone with authority tried to break it up, saying enough had been shown. The plea landed wrong. To the onlookers hungry for a finish, restraint sounded like weakness. The noise rose just enough to steal silence. The heavyweight edged forward, a small test, checking whether Bruce would give ground straight back. Bruce didn't. He shifted his height, barely, lowering his center and letting the imagined target sink away. It disrupted the picture the big man was carrying in his head. Timing lives on pictures, and Bruce had changed the frame. He asked for one more step of space, the kind of request that doubles as a last chance to stop. The room refused him quiet. His attention dropped to feet and balance, to how weight would travel if momentum met resistance. He counted the risks that weren't about him. A shoulder too close to the ropes, a slick patch waiting to steal traction. This wasn't about landing hard. It was about what would happen after. Then he offered a condition that sounded like concession and functioned like a lock. No trade, no follow-up. One brief action to settle it. The heavyweight agreed, not with words, but with the way he set himself, convinced he could absorb anything short of a full exchange. In that agreement, the test had already begun. Bruce felt it settle into his body like a quiet switch being thrown. If he delayed, someone else would push it over the edge. If he acted poorly, the edge would cut someone. He chose. The room recoiled by instinct, a half-step backward that created a fragile pocket of space. No one announced it, but everyone felt that the margin for error had vanished. The heavyweight stood almost still, yet his balance was no longer even. One side carried more promise of force than the other, ready to surge if the exchange became mutual. Bruce did not retreat and did not charge. He moved on an angle so small it looked accidental, slipping off the center line while closing the distance to where control lives. According to those closest, the action itself barely registered as motion. There was no swing, no dramatic crack, just a brief, exact contact placed where damage is avoidable but consequence is not. The effect was immediate and strange. The heavyweight did not topple or stagger theatrically. Instead, his forward intention failed to arrive. His step broke halfway through, as if the instruction had been sent but never received. Weight redistributed in a hurry. Breath caught, not painfully, but enough to demand attention. Bruce removed pressure at once. No follow-up, no chase. He lifted a hand, palm open, a universal signal that needed no translation. Enough. The gesture cooled the air faster than words could have. For a fraction of a second, nothing moved. Then a loud exhale escaped somewhere behind the ropes, the sound of lungs released from duty. The ropes themselves creaked as someone realized they were leaning too hard. Bruce's shoulders softened, his hand relaxed, as though a current had been switched off. The heavyweight looked at him again, and the look had changed. Not insulted, assessed. He tested his footing with a subtle shift, confirming that his body was listening once more. He chose not to answer with anger, and that choice spoke louder than any punch. A voice tried to minimize what had happened, calling it nothing, a tap, but the people closest didn't join in. They had felt how mass can be interrupted without being humiliated. They understood that something smaller than violence had ended a much larger threat. In the center of the ring, there was a hollow where the moment had passed, an absence that carried weight. And everyone sensed that what followed would matter as much as the contact itself. The room began to breathe again, but quietly, as if loud voices might reopen something that had just closed. Conversations restarted in fragments, softer than before. Shoes shifted, not rushing. The heavyweight stepped to the side and drew one glove back, giving himself a second that mattered. It was restraint no one had demanded from him, and that made it noticeable. Bruce did not move closer. He kept a respectful distance, his posture neutral, his eyes level. There was no victory stance, no searching for acknowledgement. The absence of celebration unsettled those who had wanted a clear winner. What replaced it was discomfort. especially for the men who had urged the moment forward and now felt the weight of their own appetite. The heavyweight's face settled. He made a short, almost private gesture. Neither apology nor challenge. It read as recognition, not friendship, not defeat. An understanding that something had been measured honestly. Bruce answered in kind, a minimal response that closed the exchange without sealing it into spectacle. Someone tried to pull a final line from him, something quotable, something sharp enough to travel. Bruce didn't give it. He redirected attention to space and safety, motioning people back, easing the pressure out of the circle. The story, he seemed to say without saying, didn't need sharpening. As the tension drained, small human details surfaced. A man's hands shook as he wrapped them together. Another laughed once, too late, then stopped. Someone stared at the floor, replaying what they'd almost pushed into happening. The heavyweight's breathing slowed, still deep, but no longer driving forward. Bruce left the way he had arrived, without noise. Near the exit, he paused for a beat, as if checking that the challenge wouldn't follow him into the hall. Then he stepped through the doorway, and the ring behind him felt suddenly ordinary. By the time people reached the corridor, the story had already begun to stretch and bend. Details inflated. Certainty crept in where there had been none. Bruce didn't correct it. He never would. What mattered stayed behind in the room. Not fear, not dominance, but a clear boundary that had held. Those who stood closest would later say the strangest thing wasn't the contact itself. It was how quickly Bruce Lee removed the threat afterward, how he took tension out of the air first, as if strength existed not to prove, but to stop.